even with all the time given up to me now by lockdown, there still isn't enough time. It takes forever, and it's a good job I'm semi-retired from being a part of the School of Computer Science at Nottingham, because honestly, as a regular employee, I could not justify the hours I've spent on my latest ultra-fascinating project. I refer you, my dear Watson, to the strange case of Dennis Ritchie's missing thesis. We all know who Dennis is. Unix was invented by Ken and Dennis, Ken Thompson, Dennis Ritchie. If you want to simplify things, Ken was sort of in charge of Unix, the operating system. Anything to do with creating C language facilities and C compilers, because remember, Unix was one of the very first operating systems to be written in a specially invented high-level language called C. And Dennis was absolute whiz with the C compiler, and it needed both of them to do this. So again, many of you will know Dennis because one of the best-selling computer programming textbooks of all time is the C programming language by Dennis Ritchie and our good Computerphile colleague and friend Brian Kernighan. There's some big gaps in our knowledge about Dennis, and I should remind you, I think sadly he died in 2010 and has been much missed in the 10 years or so since that. But recently, the Computer History Museum in the USA came up with a story which just amazed everybody. People who knew him said, yeah, he went to Harvard. And I think he did an applied mathematics degree. So, of course, he was Dr. Ritchie, wasn't he? He did a PhD. Well, the answer is he studied for a PhD, but it never properly got submitted. Examination panel was appointed. They never met, and the CHM story basically says we don't totally feel happy about this story. The cover story is that there was a standoff and that there was a need to submit a bound library copies of his thesis. Dennis objected to having to pay to have this done. He thought he'd made enough sacrifices already, presumably, in keeping himself alive while he did his PhD thesis. It's worth saying his PhD was a very theoretical one, and coming out of a maths department, perhaps not too surprising, but he regarded his thesis as something to be got out of the way, but he was far more interested in playing space wars and writing real C programs that were useful to help out Ken, his newfound friend, you see. I know you'll all say, you know everybody, don't name drop. Yes, I have to confess, I did meet Dennis Ritchie once. It was in 1986. Brian had been over to see me in the early 80s. I paid a return visit to Bell Labs. I had a very enjoyable lunch. Dennis, Ken, Brian and me, in which Ken regaled us with his story about if you were a qualified pilot, you could get to fly a MiG in Russia if you played your cards right. They were so short of foreign currency and foreign exchange in that time. Any gimmick that brought in tons of dollars, you see, was absolutely fine. So yes, I did meet Dennis just that once, and he's a totally charming guy. It takes one to spot one. He's a computer scientist, and so was Ken. They were so similar to each other, but so different. You know, they had this wicked way of answering exactly what you'd asked, not what you wish you'd asked. Ken didn't get a PhD, but he did enroll for a master's, I think, at Berkeley, and got that, so he was known about. But everybody just assumed that Dennis must have got his PhD from Harvard. There were no hitches. Turns out there were, and Bell Labs were not pleased to find that this person they'd appointed, who they knew was good, they chased after him as solidly as they chased after Ken. I think they were tipped off how good he was. But to find suddenly, I think somebody from Bell Labs wrote Harvard and said, what is going on? When will Mr. Ritchie get his PhD? And got back the frostiest reply you will ever see, effectively saying, we have no plans, nor are we likely to have any plans to give Mr. Ritchie a PhD thesis. You know, He had upset somebody mightily. And neither I, nor Brian, nor his brother Bill, still, we don't know the true story. Maybe we never will. 1967 is a long time ago, even for me. Even for me, just think of that. I was only 23. Oh, it's like back in the Jurassic, you know. And just to put things absolutely clear, what would have been available to Dennis for his output medium for his thesis? Really, something like a Clattery Model 37 teletype were becoming available. They had a fixed character set. You couldn't sort of extend it in any way, but they were very good. I mean, you could have a teletype plugged in. They were used in stock exchanges, so they were a common currency. So you could plug a teletype into your computer.
So this thesis does exist then?
It did exist, you see. His sister Lynn, who I think died 2 or 3 years ago, she was very fond of her brother, looked after him carefully. She had a copy of his finally submitted thesis. One of his fellow PhD students, also from Harvard, Albert Meyer, quite a name in theoretical computer science, but of course, again, now he'll have retired. He had one. And the other one, if you like, was Dennis's own working copy, which eventually got submitted, or was about to be submitted. Normally, at this period, what you would do was handwrite all your great thoughts and hand it to a typist. The idea of being able to do it on a computer and with computer assistance was at its very, very infancy. We have a copy here of what it was like. Could have been submitted, it didn't get submitted. But Dennis decided quite rightly that a teletype terminal wasn't powerful enough because it didn't have enough characters. So if you're going to either hand type it or typeset it from a peripheral stuck into a computer, what were your options? Well, your options were either an ultra expensive, very early photo typesetter, font characters as photos on a film strip. So your A to Z were 26 different little bits of film, probably wrapped around a drum that you could illuminate from behind. Massively, massively expensive. Even Bell Labs hadn't invested in one of those at the time, although a few years later they did. No, if you come back from those rarefied heights, you could type it by hand, and if it was an old-fashioned typewriter, you had special characters on little things that looked like nail varnish sticks that you put into the throat of the typewriter, and you hit any key, and it was like a sort of relayed impact. That alpha character was actually, you typed I or something, any character would do, and it hit the back of this special gadget, and you got, at the right place, the letter alpha. But going beyond that, because that was a pain, IBM came up with the idea of a golf ball typewriter.
This is the best thing that's happened to typing since electricity. The IBM Selectric typewriter.
They are miraculous things. Unbelievable. What they did was that instead of having 26 different dipsticks for weird characters, they would put them on, let's say, a Greek character's golf ball for special purposes. You take out your regular golf ball, you plug in a Greek character's one. When you look at the way that they embedded those metal characters onto the surface of a sphere in such a way that if the sphere rocked ever so slightly, another row of characters became, as it were, normal to the paper and could be hit.
In a typewriter, you can have little arms with a metal kind of thing that gets
at the end, and they all end up in the neck or the throat or whatever it's called. And on a conventional typewriter, you move the sheet around. With a Selectric, you only move the sheet for line feeds, forward and back. You didn't move the sheet for horizontal motion. This unbelievable cradle with a golf ball in it, going seemingly at the speed of sound, was leaping all over left and right, putting in characters. It is an electromechanical marvel of the first order and did not come cheap. It cost as much. Well, the story at the time was Those of you on the far side of the Atlantic can translate this better than me. It cost as much as a Buick. Now, a Buick is not an utterly luxurious saloon, I don't think, but it's not cheap. And it certainly wasn't cheap in those days. So it cost as much as a medium-sized saloon car just for this output device. And Dennis, having been taken on by Bell Labs as the bright new lad, actually conned them into letting him have an online version of one of these devices. It's called a 2741, and a dedicated line that had a monthly rental at eye-watering prices, just so that as well as working for Bell Labs in his new job, he could also have a golf ball machine down there where he did experiments in how to typeset his thesis properly. And Brother Bill will point to his website, aged 9 years old at the time, was just in awe of Dennis sitting in their basement in the Ritchie family house. Dennis rented the basement, just swapping golf balls and messing about with this thing in one corner of the basement, from what I understand. But even so, how did he in the end manage 180 pages of thesis with changes of characters all over the place?
Because we're talking about typesetting equations here, aren't we, as much?
Yes, I probably better turn our attention to this one, I think, which is pretty horrifying. I mean, when you look at it, there are the obvious alphabetic characters there, but at the moment, inked in is a Greek rho, or is it a P symbol, in Dennis's own handwriting. And just the sheer density of this stuff, one on top of another. A funny thing there, which is a Monas operator. So this is horrifying to contemplate, is how many golf ball changes would you need to typeset that page? Because what you've got to do is do all the easy stuff, and there isn't much easy stuff here. Set it back, in a sense, to a home position and put the paper back in again. In other words, if it's on track to feed, make sure you get back to exactly the right start position. Then go through it, waving the golf ball around on its carriage and then deciding, I'm needed there. Let's type one character there. So you might end up having to do multi-pass processing on just about every page, depending on complexity. Now, some of you may remember we did, actually, you may not even recognise it as a comparable exercise. About 6 or 7 years ago, we did a thing about the vacation memo. It was a 13-page memo of the fights they'd had with Mergenthaler and with the hardware to get everything working, but they succeeded in the end. We effectively want to do, for Dennis's thesis, what we did in rescuing the vacation memo. The trouble is, it's not only 10 times longer, is his thesis, it's also easily 10 times harder to do because his material is so complex. The stuff on the 202, we were rescued by the fact that fonts carried on beyond the 202 into the great new world of Adobe Type 1, TrueType fonts, OpenType fonts. For those of you into this, there are standards. You can miss out all the stuff in the middle, take a flying leap into the world of fonts, and things become easier. Fortunately, how do we make our flying leap here? Here is a font, if you care to call it that, which basically exists on a golf ball on a typewriter. Not a traditional conveyance mechanism for what a typographer would call a real font. Nevertheless, our good friend Chuck Bigelow, typographer, giant of the Lucida typeface family, in advising us said, I'll have a look around and see if somebody has seen fit to turn the Selectrix font into what we would call a proper font. And he found for us from the Bitstream foundry a font which I think is called Pica 10, and it's pretty darned close to what a standard Selectric golf ball has got. But unfortunately, nobody did the exotic symbols. And the thing about the main running text is that because it came off a typewriter, it's what's called fixed pitch. Maybe a lot of you don't realise this, but if you have a fixed pitch typewriter, have you ever noticed that the problem is that the letter I looks very lonely because there has to be a lot of space on either side of it. The fixed pitch of these characters is 602 1,000ths of an inch. Okay for ordinary alphabets. But when you get extended characters like a Greek alpha, which has got a floppy head and a floppy tail, they don't look very good, fixed pitch. You have to redesign them, but they look all constrained and not their usual florid self. There have been no fixed pitch redrawings, as far as we can find, into a font of the Greek symbol ball. It's a minority interest. So I've had to do my best in rescuing Dennis's thesis. Work is ongoing and will take quite some time yet, to say, well, we'll have to use a variable pitched typewriter-like font for the exotic symbols. So, for example, the alpha symbol in Greek requires variable pitch 890 1,000ths, not 602. And if you start to say, come on, Brailsford, stop being lazy, just take the variable pitched font and, using your innate skills, oh no, squash it down into being a fixed pitch version of itself. It's hard. If you don't believe me, read my semi-rant back in the vacation memo paper. It took me something like between 120 and 150 hours to create a font called Printout. And the results look rubbish, unless you have artistic innate capability, which I don't. It means that my lines on the rebuild are sometimes a bit longer than Dennis's, because I'm having to use quite a few variable pitch characters that are inevitably, they look more elegant, but they're longer than they would be in the fixed pitch version. So, under my left finger is the stuff that Dennis left, his display equations. Swapping over quickly, here, using the Bitstream Pica 10 font, is my attempted rebuild of the same material. I'm still working on it, but can you see the pi symbol there? Looks better. There's all sorts of things. For those of you saying, well, how are you producing it? I've allowed myself the anachronism of going 5 years later in Bell Labs history. Anybody who's into ancient units will say that was yelling out for EQN and TROF. Why didn't Dennis use them? They hadn't been invented. His thesis was in 1967. EQN and TROF weren't there till 1972. And it's got superscript and subscript positions, and you must respect those because those affect the meaning of the equations. He was 5 years ahead of his time, and Lord knows how he did it, but in following him, may we be forgiven. We're giving ourselves 5 years benefit and comforting ourselves that had Dennis done his thesis 5 years later, he would have used these tools. So we have used EQN to set these equations, feeding into the device-independent version of TROF, because stylistically and date-wise, they are earlier than things like Tech and LaTeX by a bit. So this seemed to us to be the best reproduction compromise.
Looks very, very similar. So if the robot is actually here, it would say that I might be here, I might be here, or I might be here. And we do represent
like that.
This.
Let's be clear in all of this work that I shall be doing now with disks and stacks.